Morning, everyone. It's me, Mr. Marsack. This is going to be my first video that I'm going to make for you guys. This came in my shop the other day. Hasn't been run in probably 10 years, the guy thinks. So the first thing we're going to do is pull that carburetor off, and I'm going to go in depth and show you exactly how to properly clean and rebuild that carburetor. I got this far. I've got the fuel draining, and just by the smell of it, I know this carburetor is completely gummed up. So I'll let this drain and continue getting the carburetor off. So I just got the carburetor off, set it on my bench, and as you can see, it's leaking what fuel is left in it onto my table. And by the color of it, you can tell that it's definitely past its prime. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hose the carburetor off with carburetor cleaner, just so we don't knock any of that dirt and debris inside when we split it apart. That should be good. Unfortunately, I don't have a really nice ultrasonic parts washer like what we have at school. As you can see, this is a factory Tecumseh carburetor, which is actually really hard to find these days. So we're going to do whatever we can to make sure we can reuse this carburetor. It looks much newer than the rest of the tiller also. So I'm going to assume it's been replaced recently. Probably the last time it was ran. Before we disassemble this screw on the bottom is your main adjustment for the fuel going in the emulsion tube up through the body of the carburetor. So what we're going to do is we're going to thread this all the way in and count how many turns we spin this in so that we know where it was set before we started taking it apart. And it actually was a nice even number. It had 2 turns out. So now when we go to put this back together, we'll know right where to set it. It's hard to tell in the video, but there's definitely some dirt on this needle, so I'm going to say we're going to find something inside this carb. What we're going to do is we're going to remove this nut that actually holds the bowl onto the carburetor. One thing I'm noticing as I take this apart, oh yeah, yep, that's not very pretty. But I noticed, you see these droplets? That's water that was inside the bowl. Now water is heavier than gasoline, so it's always going to sit on the very bottom, and what will happen is the carburetor is not able to pull that up the emulsion tube, which is right there, and it's also not able to atomize it. So it'll actually create a blockage and not allow fuel into the engine. So we're going to remove this pivot, which holds our float in place, and we're going to remove our needle valve and our gasket around the body of the carburetor. Now that that's done, what I always like to do is I'll take the float. Usually plastic doesn't have this problem, but you'll shake it. And you're listening for fuel inside of the float. Now if you hear that, chances are there's a crack somewheres, or on the old brass floats, it could have corroded, creating a pinhole, and the float would be junk because it will not float at the same height that it is intended to. That's considered a sunken float. Very common on older equipment with the brass floats. This one, however, is fine. So we're going to set that aside. We're going to inspect our needle. And what you're looking for is a ridge around this tapered point on the end of the needle. This one, however, looks fine. It is a little dirty, so we're going to clean it up. You want to make sure not to lose this little spring on the top of it because that's what holds it in place. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pop the emulsion tube right out of the center stem of the carburetor. Cast it in place so I'm unable to remove it. So we're just going to have to do the best we can to clean it with it in place. A lot of these older Tecumseh carburetors had what's called a Welch plug that would be pressed in this opening right here. But some of the newer castings, they eliminated it. This is one of the ones that they eliminated. Another thing we're going to look for is right down where the needle seats. Again, it's very difficult for me to get a good image of this opening, but there's a little rubber seat that sets all the way down in there. And what you want to do is you want to inspect that and make sure there's no dirt and debris, and make sure that the rubber is not deteriorated. With this particular one, you're going to have to take my word for it because I can't actually show you, but it is in very good shape. I think this carburetor is really just going to need a good thorough cleaning. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to take the carb cleaner and I'm going to spray it in all of the orifices and all of the openings. Oh, I lied. We're going to remove our idle speed jet next, and we're going to do the same thing we did with the main jet. We're going to thread it in, count the number of turns, so we can place it back in the same location. This one was 1 3/4 of turns out from being seated. So now we know where we'll be putting that one back to when we reassemble. So now we're going to just hose it all out. You want to make sure you get in all of the jets, the inlet needle and seat, the emulsion tube, down in where this Welch plug would have been, in through all of the jets in the front of the carburetor. And all the locations that we took those needles out of. So our idle speed jet, and the parts that our main jet came out of. Also our needles. And what I like to do is I will usually pile everything in the bowl that I want cleaned. Kind of hose it off. It sort of holds everything in place, and you can let it soak for a little while. So I'm going to do that, and then I will come back when it's ready to be dried off. Now that I've washed all the parts of the carburetor with carburetor cleaner, I'm going to take compressed air and I'm going to very carefully dry everything off and try and clean out anything that could be left behind in any of the openings of the carburetor. You want to be extremely careful not to shoot parts across the shop. For instance, if you were to blow air in the fuel inlet, you will shoot this little rubber seat across the shop and you will probably never find it again. So we're not going to do that, and seeing that this one is in good shape, we're going to leave it right in place. Now that we've got all the parts nice and clean, we're going to do a last minute inspection, and there's a couple things I want you to keep an eye on. Right at the base of the throttle and choke shaft, there's a felt gasket. And what that does is it keeps dirt and debris from getting down into your throttle shaft or choke shaft, which would cause it to wear out and eventually cause an ambient air leak and lean out the mixture for your engine. These look to be in very good shape. So what we're going to do is start reassembly. And I'm going to start with our idle speed jet, which we checked, we seated it, and it was 1 3/4 turns from being seated. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to thread it all the way in until it touches down. You don't want to force it because you could damage the needle and the seat. And then we're going to back it off that 1 3/4 turns. So I'm going to do that right now. What I'm going to do is install our needle and our float, holding it in place with our pivot pin, and I'm going to install the gasket around the body. When you install the needle, make sure you clip that little spring onto this tab on the bottom of the float. I've got the main components on the inside of the carburetor installed. Now, what I want you to look at is see how when I'm holding the carburetor flush, the float is sitting up at an angle. That means that the float height is improperly adjusted and it will not allow enough fuel into the carburetor for it to run correctly. What you're looking for is you want that float to sit parallel to the base of the carburetor. And what you'll do is that metal tab I pointed out earlier will bend. And you're just going to bend it until that float sits perfectly parallel or level. Right there is what you're looking for. All I did is reach in with a screwdriver to that tab and bent it until the float sits flush, or level, sorry. So now we're ready to install the float bowl. And the float bowl will help hold this pivot pin in place as well. You'll notice there's a lower section. You want that lower section to go to the side that the float wants to naturally hang down on. So be sure when installing, you're going to set it up just like so. And now I'm going to thread the nut back into the body to hold the bowl in place. There's no torque spec on this bowl nut. You just want to tighten it until you'll feel it stop and just snug a little bit past. And the last step is our main needle needs to be reinstalled. This one was an easy one. I believe we said it was 2 turns out. So once again, we're going to thread this all the way in until it stops. Again, not forcing it because you will damage the needle and seat. And once it stops, we're going to back it off 2 full turns. Right there it stops. You look at it. That's a half a turn. That's 1 full turn. There's 1.5. And 2 turns. So now the carburetor is completely reassembled, cleaned, and ready to go. And all of the settings are back where they belong. We won't know if that's where they're supposed to be until we start the tiller. But that will be probably another day's project. Hope you enjoyed. This is my first video. I think it went pretty well. I'm going to have a few questions posted about the carburetor rebuild. And give me some feedback. Thanks. Take care, guys.